It's like gold dust, you hear me coming through your speakers.
The late 19th century was a beneficial time period for the social classes, especially the working class. People in the working class would work ridiculous hours and would receive very low paychecks. The workers were sick and tired of how they were being treated, so they stood up and fought for themselves. Many strikes occurred because of how bosses of companies treated their employees. Also, many labor unions were created to represent the workers and help the workers go on strike and help fight for better pay and better workloads. Middle-class families and working-class families differed in many ways. Working-class families would not be able to afford to put their children through high school, and middle-class families were able to afford their children going to high school and maybe college. The average work day of a working class would be 13.5 hours. Working-class families did not make enough money to support their family. One strike that occurred was the Haymarket Riot on May 4th of 1866 in Chicago, Illinois. It was a labor protest rally. It began because workers were striking for 8-hour workdays. It quickly turned into a riot when someone threw a bomb at the police. Another strike was the Pullman strike, which was also located in Illinois. The strike began because of how George Pullman, founder and president of Pullman Palace Car Company, treated his workers. George created a city called Pullman City to house workers, and the workers were required to live there. The workers were also supposed to expect pay cuts at any given time and to not complain about workloads. The workers had to pay rent to George if they wanted to use the church. In 1893, factory wages fell about 25%. Rent charges did not decrease, and if a worker was in debt, the money would be taken from their paycheck. On May 11, 1894, workers went on a wildcat strike, which is a strike without being authorized by their union. Strikers belonged to the American Railroad Union, which was founded by Eugene V. Debs. One of the largest and most important labor organizations founded in 1869 was the Knights of Labor. The organization was semi-secret because men who joined unions were fired from their jobs. The most important leader of the organization was Terence V. Powderly. The Knights of Labor promoted social and cultural uplift of working men. They are in favor of 8-hour working days and emphasize better working conditions, better pay, and better job safety. The Knights of Labor welcomed everyone, including African American women and unskilled workers. They excluded bartenders, lawyers, gamblers, and Roman Catholics. Powderly made it more open to Catholics. The late 19th century was definitely a golden age for the working class. The workers were finally able to have a say and get the hours and pay they wanted. Though it may have been a tough journey to get their desires, the finishing product showed that everything that happened was completely worth it.
The evolution of industrialization between the years of 1870 and 1897 was beneficial and positive. During this time, there was public education, equality for farmers and equality in shipment prices, large businesses to support industrialization, philanthropists who donated much of their fortune to the common good, and cartels, as well as the idea of a free market economy. Public education came from the Morrill Land-Grant Act that allowed for the creation of land-grant colleges and universities. These universities were aimed to provide a higher education for all the people of America, and they emphasized the farming education in the West. This program reached people from all over the country and people of every social class. The Interstate Commerce Act provided for a fair playing field for all shippers and prevented large shippers from monopolizing the industry, much like the Granger laws did. The railroad industry rapidly increased during this time and required big businesses to run and fund them. Big businesses required people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller to run them. Carnegie used the idea of vertical integration to run multiple stages of production in a steel company. He was able to maximize profit by cutting out the middleman. Rockefeller used a different method of integration that is horizontal. He purchased multiple oil companies which were all at the same level of production. Both these industrialists were also philanthropists, which means they donated money to the common good. Over his lifetime, Andrew Carnegie donated $4.8 billion in today's figures, and Rockefeller donated over $8 billion. Cartels were also used to regulate the industry. Cartels are when competing businesses make agreements to fix prices in order to limit competition. This made it easier for more than one business to be powerful in an industry. In addition to when an industry is in distress, when corporations avoid bankruptcy, they also avoid the loss of many jobs. However, cartels were eliminated with the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act promotes a free market economy in which prices are based on supply and demand. This also supports the idea of competition because it forces companies to compete for customers with lower prices. In this way, it helped the general public. In conclusion, this era was more than just gilded. This era was not just beneficial for the small percent of wealthy individuals. It was a positive time for all because industries flourished and everyone was affected by the economy.
After the Civil War, the South was rebuilt from the ground up. New social codes were enforced, blacks had a new place in society, and Birmingham, Alabama was a manufacturing center for iron and steel. In the Upper South, more and more jobs were being created for all races, like working in mines, railroads, and iron furnace factories. Before, blacks could only be slaves, but now they had the opportunity to expand their horizons. Schools, women's clubs, churches, businesses, and colleges, among other things, helped the support of working and middle-class blacks. Some of the new social codes enforced were the Jim Crow laws. They were a set of laws to keep blacks and whites from socializing too much. They included things like all railroads must have separate but equal accommodations for whites and colored races. The Jim Crow laws promoted separate but equal. They were legal and did not violate anyone's constitutional rights. Jim Crow laws were there to keep races apart and not make any one race superior or inferior. One black scholar who was an activist for human rights and the founder of the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute was Booker T. Washington. People of all races looked to Washington when it came to their rights. Washington was the author of the Atlantic Compromise, where he told both blacks and whites to look around. Whites were here to provide jobs which blacks needed, and blacks were here to work hard. Washington pushed the idea that blacks needed to focus on making sure that they had the skills to be self-sufficient instead of worrying too much about being equal with whites. As long as they both realized that the other is here to help them, what difference does it make if they can use the same bathroom or not? Washington realized that blacks couldn't just join society and expect everything to be given them. It takes work to get to the top. Booker T. Washington was a vital part of racial justice. W.E.B. Du Bois was another well-educated black man who fought for the rights and equalities of blacks. He was the organizer of the Niagara Movement, which was when a group of black leaders met at Niagara Falls to fight for the rights of blacks. There they created the Declaration of Principles, which wanted reinstallment of voting for blacks, an end to segregation, and complete equality in both economical and educational opportunity, which remained the foundation for racial justice. Du Bois was also one of the founders of the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still around today. The NAACP fought for the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The NAACP also got the Supreme Court to overturn Southern peonage laws. This meant that it was a crime for sharecroppers to break their labor contracts. Because of the NAACP, blacks gained right like enlisting in the military. Fighting in the Army promoted racial justice in the U.S. and abroad. In the Plessy v. Ferguson trial, the Supreme Court ruled segregation constitutional. Segregation is constitutional because citizens are equal before the law, and simply having different trained cars for whites and blacks does not violate anyone's constitutional rights. Segregation does not mean that whites and blacks are unequal. It simply means that they are separated. Just because there is a legal distinction does not mean that any one race is better than the other. This was a golden age in the South because blacks were having opportunities they never would have imagined to have. They had the chance to go to school, learn to read, get real jobs, work in government, and have a real impact on society. Black leaders were emerging, and blacks could fight for themselves now, something that would have never happened before the Civil War. Blacks had rights and were legally equal with whites. Things were better than ever.
I will present the next topic, the West. The Homestead Act of 1862 was one of many laws enacted between 1862 and 1916, thus falling into the category of the Homestead Acts. On May the 20th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act stated that anyone who has never taken up arms against the United States and is at least 21 years of age can apply for a federal land grant. However, the occupant would have to reside on the premises for at least 5 years and prove that improvements have been made. One of the great things about this was that it opened up the opportunities that the real estate market had to offer to a broader variety of people. In 1841, the Preemption Act stated that a head of the household, a single man over 21 or a widow, who is also a citizen of the United States and is also a resident of the claimed land for 14 months, can apply for a federal land grant. This act liberalized previous homesteading terms. Bonanza farms were large-scale farms mainly used for the production and harvesting of wheat. The first Bonanza farms were in the Red River Valley, in the Dakota Territory, and in Minnesota. During this time period, the tractor, though it would not be called a tractor for many a year afterwards, was the driving force of the Bonanza farms. It made it possible for these farmers to own these incredibly large farms while still being able to harvest their wheat. On March the 3rd, 1879, Clarence Kind was given the responsibility of being the first director of the United States Geological Survey. This survey was first started because of the large amount of land acquired by the Louisiana Purchase and Mexican-American War. The Black Hills is now home to Mount Rushmore, in which the heads of the founding fathers are carved into the side of the mountain. What people seem to have forgotten is that in 1874, Major General George Armstrong Custer of the 7th U.S. Cavalry found gold in what is now called Gold Creek near the Black Hills. The sound of gold in the creek started a gold rush, and in the following year, the Newton-Jenny Party conducted the first survey of the area. The Indian assimilation era was a time period in which the federal government of the United States felt a need to include Native Americans in the U.S. The Indian assimilation era is usually agreed to span from 1887 to 1943. In 1887, the Dawes Act, aka the General Allotment Act, was passed. This act stated the President of the United States was now authorized to survey Indian territories. The President of the United States was now authorized to divide these lands into individual allotments. Assimilation policy was mainly the United States attempting to save Indian culture by merging it with a civilized culture. If everything had gone according to plan, Indians would have lived in cities, dressed like citizens, and owned property.
Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He was one of the most widely cited jurists because of his opinion, clear and present danger, which was enforced during World War I when Schnick spoke out against the draft, similar to Vallandig's case with Lincoln, which was the majority opinion in 1919 case of Schnick versus United States. Holmes contributed to America by changing American thinking in a more legal realism rather than a formalism which America was accustomed to. Susan B. Anthony was an American civil rights leader and abolitionist. She worked alongside Elizabeth Cady Stanton and co-founded the women's temperance movement. Also, she was very famous for the writing The Revolution, which talked about women and African American suffrage, which also said equal pay for equal work. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a social activist, abolitionist, and leading figure of the early women's rights movement. She had her Declaration of Sentiments presented at the first women's rights movement held in 1848. The Declaration of Sentiments was signed by 68 women and 32 men. The Declaration of Sentiments basically demanded that women should be equal with men in education, law, and employment. Also, this was one of the first documents that demanded the women's right to vote. She fought for women's suffrage with Susan B. Anthony, which they declined to support the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment because it had no mention of the right for women to vote. Mary Baker Eddy was an American author, religious leader, and teacher. She was recognized because of her groundbreaking ideas, which she named the Christian Science. She took these major ideas and made them into a book named Science and Health with Keys to the Scriptures. 4 years after her success, she founded the Church of Christ Scientists in Boston, Massachusetts. The importance of her and her book was that it provided substantial insight into the spiritual nature of life and health. In the book, Science and Health with Keys to the Scripture, shows how she healed a person from the brink of death. Social Darwinism, a theory founded by Charles Darwin, which states that the strongest or the fittest should survive and flourish in society, while the weak and unfit should be allowed not to prosper. Herbert Spencer is the man that took this idea and adapted it to social life. This concept is important because it suggests how you can obtain the American dream, because the American dream is for the strongest and the fittest.
The evolution of government and policy during the Golden Era was an obvious step in the right direction. A lot of great ideas came into place during this era, like education, and the evolution of politics, and the ending of the spoils system, and a lot of people standing up against the corruption that the political landscape in America had been subject to. So compulsory education was first established in Massachusetts in 1852, and that's 18 years before England made education compulsory. And the law specified that children had to receive a public school education, but some children were able to attend private school, and this is great because the education system in America quickly blossomed, and the education of Native American women and blacks became much more of a priority. Um, Special interest groups were groups of people who felt they had something in common, a cause that they all thought was they could lobby for. Um, so it gave people a sense of identity, and they lobbied for the causes in Washington and locally. A civil service reform was basically at the ending of the spoils system, because the spoils system had been started by Andrew Jackson, and it became a major part of politics because federal jobs weren't handed out based on credibility anymore. And so the Pendleton Act of 1883 ended the spoils system. Mugwumps were Republican activists who switched parties during the election of 1884 and supported Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland because they didn't agree with the financial corruption surrounding him. The Republican candidate James Blaine, and they essentially decided the election by winning Cleveland, New York, and that won him the election. So mugwump is a term used to describe someone who has switched parties quickly. And only a year prior, the spoils system had been brought to an end, and so in these two.
Immigration was very beneficial in the late 19th century. It was what gave people the chance to restart their lives in a better environment. Emma Lazarus, a young poet, really helped with the circulation of immigration. She grew up in New York and wrote a poem called The New Colossus, which is about immigrants coming to the United States. A famous quote from that poem says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." This explains how the U.S. can provide new lives for people, which gave many foreigners the motivation to start a new life. Most of the immigrants stayed in narrow, low-rise apartments called tenements. With more and more immigrants piling into New York, the U.S. needed to find accommodations for everyone. Even though tenements did not have the nicest conditions, it was better than nothing. As an immigrant, you start at the bottom and you have to work your way up. Immigrants came to America for many reasons, but one of the main ones was to get away from their old country. But once you get here, you can't expect to live the nicest life. They had to pull through the hardships to achieve their main goal. At the turn of the century, there was a noticeable change in the immigrants that were coming into the U.S. The old immigrants consisted of people from Northern and Eastern Europe and were usually Protestant. They were literate and skilled workers. The new immigrants usually came from Southern or Eastern Europe and were usually Catholic, Orthodox, or Jewish. They were not very skilled or literate, but despite their differences, they both brought benefits to the U.S. The old immigrants could work in factories, mines, and railroads, which would help the U.S. economically, and they could easily assimilate into American society because they were already educated. The new immigrants provided more workers for expanding industry and increased the market for American goods. The U.S. also gave new immigrants the opportunity to become more educated and literate since their old country failed to do so. Overall, immigration was positive in the late 1800s. It gave people the benefits of having a new home, new job, and new life.
A great deal of progress was made during the Golden Age on the forefront of women's rights. Many more universities, college and high school alike, began accepting and promoting female students. The number of female enrollers in high school grew to a high 55% between the years of 1890 and 1920, and the number of state-run universities which offered education to women grew to such an extent that all but 3 offered female admittance. All these advancements enabled women of higher classes to attain a badge of dignity, and allowed women of lower classes to better their futures. Before this educational reform, only 6.4% of women professionals held non-agricultural positions, but that number soon changed to 10% and continued to grow as the era progressed. It was at the same time when the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was formed. This union began as a series of women-led nonviolent protests against the dangers of alcohol, in which women of all classes held pray-ins in local bars and saloons. As little as 3 months later, they had driven alcohol from 250 communities, thus demonstrating the power of female strength and validating their capabilities. After a series of such accomplishments, though at first it was their main objective to merely reform in respect to alcohol, their interest soon expanded to the women's suffrage movement. And by 1894, the WCTU had entered as a main player into the women's rights movement, the implications of which were astronomical and led to various developments in the fight for female equality. All these miraculous changes and swirling ideas of gender equality gave birth to an entirely new idea of woman. She was named the New Woman, characterized as one who pushed against social expectations and stereotypes forced upon her by the male-dominated society in which she lived. They were what one might think of as the first feminists. Women, however, were not the only supporters of this movement. In fact, one of the movement's main supporters, who was largely responsible for the popularization of the New Woman ideology, was a man by the name of Isbin, a popular playwright who demonstrated in his work and in public statements the unjust restrictions placed upon women in an exclusively male society. This new conception of women's character, brought about in the Golden Age, laid the road for what we know of as women and their rights today. During the Golden Age in the late 19th century, many beneficial changes in presidential policy took place. The Civil Service Reform of 1883 is one of the main fine examples. It instructed that government jobs be awarded on the basis of merit, such as exams, education, accomplishments, etc., thus allowing for only the best and brightest to enter into the federal system and barred those undeserving from entering due to political affiliation or preferential treatment. This law also made it illegal to fire or demote government employees for political reasons, such as party allegiances, and prohibited the giving out of campaign donations on government property. Appointments to government positions could no longer be made based upon bias or whimsy, nor could one fire without just cause. The government had been effectively purged of corruption. It was during the same era that the farmers had called to the government's attention fundamental issues which had to be addressed, thus allowing for future improvements. In the presidential election as well, things were proceeding positively, though it had its duller points admittedly. In the end, the honest favorite was made victor and the bully was cast off. All around, things were gleaming.